The engine noise grew louder, low and steady, rolling across the range like distant thunder, but no one moved to acknowledge it. Not yet, because every eye was still locked on the empty stand where the target had been, the absence somehow louder than the impact itself. Turner finally took a step forward, boots crunching against gravel, his voice returning but stripped of its earlier edge. "Set it back up," he ordered. Though it sounded more like a reflex than authority, two recruits hesitated. Before jogging downrange, their pace uncertain, glancing back once as if expecting someone to correct them, Noah remained behind his scope, still studying the fallen mount, tracing the invisible line that shot must have taken, his mind trying to reconstruct the path, the angle, the timing, the way the wind had shifted just enough between breaths to allow it. But nothing aligned cleanly, nothing fit inside the rules he had been taught. And that was what unsettled him the most, because this was not luck. Luck did not wait. Luck did not choose structure over surface. Turner turned back toward Reeves, studying him now, really studying him for the first time. The worn jacket, the steady hands, the complete absence of reaction. "You aiming for the mount?" he asked, the question sounding almost reluctant. Reeves did not answer immediately, his gaze drifting across the range flags as they snapped back into a sharper crosswind. Closer to 11 miles per hour now, the heat haze thickening again. "The plate lies," Reeves said quietly, his voice low but carrying just enough to reach Turner. "It shows you what the wind is doing there, not what it is doing in between." Turner frowned slightly, the explanation landing somewhere between irritation and realization. One of the recruits downrange waved, signaling the target was being reset, but his movements were slower now, more careful, as if the object itself had changed meaning. The engine sound behind them came to a stop, gravel shifting. Under tires, a door opening with a heavy, deliberate click. Still, no one turned, not fully, but a few heads began to angle slightly. Instinct pulling their attention without permission, Noah lowered his scope finally, his eyes flicking toward Reeves. "That was not a correction shot," he said, almost in disbelief. Reeves shook his head faintly. "No," he replied. "That was the only shot." The words settled over them. Simple, undeniable. Turner let out a slow breath, his posture adjusting, not fully relaxed, but no longer rigid with dismissal. Something had shifted, something he could not command away. "You ever teach?" he asked, the question coming out before he could stop it. Reeves looked at him for the first time, really looked, his pale eyes steady, unreadable. "Not anymore," he said, and then his gaze moved past Turner, past the recruits, toward the source of the engine, and this time Turner followed it, turning fully as a uniformed driver stepped aside and a tall figure emerged from the vehicle, the sunlight catching the polished insignia on his chest. Brigadier General Scott Hayes. His presence quiet but absolute, the kind that did not need announcement. Conversations did not stop because there were none left to stop. They had already been replaced by silence. Hayes took a few measured steps forward, his eyes not scanning the range, not assessing the recruits, but fixed directly on Reeves, as if confirming something long suspected. And in that moment, before a single word was spoken, before any rank was acknowledged, the entire balance of the range shifted again, not from a shot, but from recognition. No one called the range to attention, no command was given, and yet every spine straightened the moment General Hayes stepped forward, the gravel shifting under his boots the only sound breaking the stillness. Turner snapped into a rigid stance out of instinct more than order, his voice catching half a second too late as he began, "Sir." But Hayes did not look at him, did not acknowledge the formation. His focus remained fixed on Daniel Reeves, as if the rest of the range had dissolved into background noise. The wind carried a dry gust across the line, tugging at sleeves and loose fabric, but Reeves stood unmoved, his posture unchanged, as though this moment had already happened somewhere before. Hayes stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the fine details, the weathered lines in Reeves's face, the calm in his eyes, the kind of calm that does not come from peace, but from having seen enough to no longer be surprised. A long second passed, then another. No one dared speak, not the recruits, not Turner, not even Noah, who felt the weight of something larger than ranks settling over the scene. Hayes finally exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, and gave the smallest nod, not the sharp acknowledgement of command, but something quieter, something closer to recognition. I was told there was a problem on my range, Hayes said, his voice even, controlled, carrying the authority of someone who did not need to raise it. Turner found his words again, stepping forward slightly. Yes, sir. We were having difficulty with wind calls and Hayes lifted a hand just enough to stop him, not abruptly, not harshly, but with absolute finality. Turner fell silent instantly, the unfinished explanation hanging useless in the air. Hayes's gaze shifted briefly toward the distant target now being secured back onto its stand, then returned to Reeves. And you solved it, he said, not as a question. Reeves did not respond right away, his eyes following the same distant line for a moment before settling back. The wind solved it, he said quietly. Hayes's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened, as if confirming a detail only he understood. Behind them, one of the recruits adjusted his footing, the sound loud in the silence. Another cleared his throat and immediately regretted it, because this was no longer a training moment. It was something else entirely, something none of them had been prepared for. Noah felt it most clearly, the shift from instruction to history, from routine to something that carried weight beyond the range. Hayes took one more step closer, his voice lowering slightly. You still read it the same way, he said. And this time it was unmistakably personal, not a general observation, not a comment for the group. Reeves held his gaze, steady, unflinching. It does not change, he replied, the simplicity of the words landing heavier than any explanation. Turner's eyes moved between them, confusion giving way to realization in slow increments, because this was no longer about a single shot, or even a demonstration of skill. It was about something older, something that predated all of them standing there. Hayes let out a quiet breath, almost a faint trace of something like respect passing through his expression before it settled back into composure. Most people forgot how, he said. Reeves shook his head slightly. Most people stopped listening, he answered. The exchange was brief, understated, but it carried a gravity that silenced every thought on the line. Hayes turned his head just enough to glance at Turner, not fully, just enough to include him again. Sergeant, he said. Turner snapped his focus forward. Yes, sir. Hayes paused for half a beat, then said, you might want to reconsider who you hand a rifle to. The words were not loud, not aggressive, but they landed with precision. Turner's jaw tightened as he nodded once. Yes, sir. And when Hayes looked back at Reeves, there was no rank in the space between them, no command, no hierarchy, just recognition, the kind that does not need to be explained. And for the first time since the shot, Reeves shifted his weight slightly, as if preparing to leave, but the moment held, suspended, because something unspoken had not yet been revealed, something that every person on that range could feel, even if they did not yet understand it. The silence did not break when Reeves shifted his weight. It deepened, stretching across the range like the heat rising off the ground, because no one wanted to be the one who spoke first. No one wanted to risk saying the wrong thing in a moment that clearly no longer belonged to them. Hayes studied him for another second. Then his eyes dropped briefly to the rifle still resting in Reeves's hands, his gaze settling on that worn groove along the stock, the same mark Reeves had touched before the shot. And something in Hayes's posture changed again, subtle but unmistakable, as if a memory had just aligned with reality. That rifle, Hayes said quietly, not to the group, not even fully to Reeves, but more like confirming a detail out loud. You always held it a little lower than the rest. Turner frowned slightly, the comment making no sense to him. But Noah felt it again. That shift, that sense of stepping into something already written long before today. Reeves glanced down at the rifle, his thumb brushing the groove once more. Wind reads better from here, he said. Simple, direct, but Hayes gave a faint nod, like he had expected that answer decades ago, not seconds. The recruits downrange finished resetting the target and began walking back, slower than before. Their usual chatter gone, replaced by glances toward the line, toward the general, toward the old man who had somehow changed the entire rhythm of the day. Turner cleared his throat, trying to regain some form of structure. Sir, with your permission, we can continue the exercise. Hayes did not respond immediately, his eyes still on Reeves, measuring something unseen. Then finally he spoke. You have been running this line all morning. Turner straightened. Yes, sir. Hayes nodded once, then gestured slightly toward the rifle. Then let him run it. The words landed heavier than any command Turner had received that day. His jaw tightened, not in defiance, but in the effort to process what had just been said, to hand over control, even temporarily, to someone he had dismissed minutes ago. He hesitated for half a breath before stepping back. "Yes, sir," he said, the response automatic. But the shift undeniable. All eyes turned to Reeves again, waiting, uncertain, the authority now sitting quietly in his hands whether he accepted it or not. Reeves looked at the line, at the recruits standing in uneven formation, at the flags snapping in layered currents, at the distant target newly set, and for a moment he said nothing, just observed, the same way he had from the beginning. Then he handed the rifle back to Turner, the motion calm, unhurried. "They do not need me," he said. Hayes watched him closely. "They do," he replied, not raising his voice, not forcing the point, just stating it as fact. Reeves shook his head slightly, his gaze moving to Noah for a brief second, then back to Hayes. "They need to see it," he said, "not be told." The words settled over the group, and for Noah, something clicked, something that had nothing to do with calculations or equipment, something about observation, about patience, about understanding what could not be measured. Hayes exhaled slowly, a faint trace of something like agreement crossing his expression. "Then show them," he said, this time not as a suggestion, not as a question, but as a quiet directive that carried more weight than any order shouted across the range. Reeves looked back toward the target, the wind shifting. Again, flags snapping in different directions at different distances, a layered pattern most of them still could not read, and slowly, without ceremony, he stepped forward toward the firing line, not as an instructor, not as a demonstration, but as something else entirely, something that did not need a title, and as he moved, the recruits instinctively adjusted, spacing out, clearing the line, giving him room without being told, because even without understanding, they knew they were about to witness something they had not been taught how to learn. Reeves stepped onto the firing line without urgency, the gravel shifting softly under his boots as the wind brushed past in uneven currents, the flags snapping in different directions now, one pulling left at nearly 10 miles per hour, another barely moving, a third flicking in short, unpredictable bursts that would confuse any standard calculation. The recruits watched closely, closer than they had all morning, their earlier confidence replaced by a quiet tension that made every movement feel significant. Turner stood just behind them, no longer leading, no longer correcting, his arms at his sides, eyes fixed forward as if trying to relearn something he had thought he already understood. Reeves did not reach for the rifle immediately. Instead, he walked a slow arc along the line, his gaze moving from flag to flag, then to the dust along the ground, then to the distant target, not once, but several times, building something in his mind that none of them could see. Noah followed every movement, his own breathing unconsciously matching the rhythm of the old man's steps. "What is he looking for?" one recruit whispered under his breath. But no one answered, because the question itself felt too small for what was happening. Reeves finally stopped, not at the center of the line, but slightly off to the side, a position no one else had used all day, as if the angle itself mattered more than the distance. He reached out and took the rifle again, this time not as a demonstration, but as a continuation, his hands steady, familiar, the worn groove finding his thumb without hesitation. He brought the rifle up slowly, aligning it not directly at the center of the target, but slightly below and to the right, an adjustment so subtle most of them would have missed it if they had not been watching so carefully. The wind shifted again, a brief lull dropping it to nearly 6 miles per hour, then rising sharply in a layered crosscurrent that moved differently at 200 yards than it did at 600. Reeves did not fire. He waited, the pause stretching longer than before, long enough for doubt to creep back into the edges of the recruits' minds, long enough for Turner to feel the old instinct to step in, to correct, to command, but he did not move, because something in him now understood that interruption would only prove how little he had seen. Reeves exhaled slowly, not fully, just enough to settle the motion, and in that stillness, the world seemed to narrow, the sound of the wind dulling, the heat shimmer softening, the entire range compressing into a single line between him and the target. And then he fired, the crack sharp, but controlled, echoing once across the open space. And again there was no immediate reaction, no visible strike, no satisfying clang, just silence, heavier this time, deeper, because now they knew better than to trust what they could see first. Noah leaned into his scope instantly, adjusting focus with a precision he had not used before, searching not for the plate, but for the structure behind it, for the hidden points that held everything together. His voice came out slower this time, more certain. "It is not the plate again," he said, and one by one, the recruits shifted, some raising their own optics, others simply staring harder, as if effort alone might reveal the answer. A faint tremor ran through the target, almost imperceptible, then another, slightly stronger, traveling up from the base, the mount holding for a second longer before giving way, the plate tilting, then dropping cleanly once more, not from impact, but from precision, from understanding, from a shot placed where no one else had thought to aim. The line went completely still, not even a breath out of place, and behind them, Hayes watched without speaking, his eyes fixed on Reeves, not surprised, not impressed, but confirming something that had never needed proof. No one moved when the second target dropped. Not immediately, because now it was no longer a surprise. It was a pattern, and patterns carried meaning, the kind that could not be ignored or explained away. The wind continued to shift across the range in uneven layers, brushing against uniforms, tugging at loose straps, but it no longer felt like an obstacle. It felt like part of something larger, something Reeves had been reading long before any of them realized it could be read at all. He lowered the rifle again, the motion calm, almost indifferent, as if the result had never been in question, and for the first time, he stepped back from the line without looking at the target, without confirming the outcome, because he did not need to. Turner watched him closely, his expression no longer guarded by authority, but stripped down to something more honest, something closer to respect, though he had not yet found the words to match it. One of the recruits exhaled slowly, a breath he did not realize he had been holding. Another shifted his stance, boots scraping lightly against gravel, the smallest sounds now carrying weight in the silence. Noah lowered his scope with care, not rushing this time, his eyes moving from the distant stand to Reeves, then to Hayes, trying to connect something that still felt just out of reach. That was not adjustment, Noah said quietly, more certain now, more grounded. That was intention. No one corrected him, no one laughed, because the difference mattered. Hayes finally stepped forward again, closing the distance with measured steps, his presence steady, controlled, but there was something else now, something beneath the surface, something that did not belong to rank or protocol. He stopped beside Reeves, not in front of him, not behind him, but beside him, as if acknowledging a position rather than assigning one. "Most men would take the center," Hayes said, his voice low enough that only those closest could hear. Reeves nodded faintly. "The center is what they show you," he replied. Hayes glanced toward the recruits, then back at the line. "And you chose what they could not see." Reeves did not answer immediately, his eyes tracking the flags again, reading the layered currents as if they were written language. "You do not choose it," he said finally. "You wait until it shows itself." The words settled into the air, not as instruction, not as theory, but as something lived, something earned over time no one there could measure. Turner stepped forward slightly, hesitation still present, but no longer holding him back. "Sir," he said to Hayes, with respect. "Who is he?" The question came out controlled, but it carried everything Turner had been holding back since the first shot. Hayes did not respond right away, his gaze still on Reeves, as if weighing whether the answer was even necessary. Then slowly, he spoke. "You have been training them to hit targets," he said, his tone even. "He trained men to understand what targets never show." Turner absorbed that, the words landing deeper than any direct explanation. The recruits stood completely still now, not out of discipline, but because movement felt out of place. Noah felt it most clearly, the shift from learning technique to witnessing something foundational, something that changed the way everything else would be understood moving forward. Reeves finally turned slightly, not fully toward the group, just enough to acknowledge their presence, his gaze passing over them without judgment, without expectation, just observation, and for a brief moment, it felt as though he was seeing each of them not as they stood now, but as what they might become if they learned to see the same way. The wind picked up again, stronger this time, snapping the flags sharply from different directions, chaotic, inconsistent, exactly the kind of condition they had struggled with all day, and Reeves looked back toward the line, then at the rifle still in Turner's hands, then at Noah, and in that quiet exchange, something unspoken passed between them, something that did not need rank or permission or even explanation, just the understanding that what had happened on that range was not over yet. The wind came harder now, no longer a shifting whisper but a layered force pressing across the range, flags snapping in conflicting directions, one pulling sharp left at nearly 14 miles per hour, while another fluttered weakly in the opposite direction. The kind of condition that had broken every shot that morning, the kind that made calculations useless and confidence collapse. And yet Reeves stood there as if none of it had changed, as if the chaos itself was something steady, something predictable if you knew where to look. Turner tightened his grip on the rifle without realizing it, his fingers resting where Reeves had held it before, feeling the faint groove along the stock, the mark that now seemed less like wear and more like a reference point, a place where something had been learned and repeated enough to leave a trace. Noah stepped forward slightly, not enough to break formation, but enough to see the line from a different angle, his mind no longer chasing numbers or corrections, but searching for patterns, for the spaces between movements, for the brief moments where everything aligned just long enough to matter. Reeves did not speak, did not instruct, he simply watched, and in that silence, something began to shift among the recruits, their posture changing, their focus narrowing, not waiting for orders but trying to anticipate something they could not yet define. Hayes remained still behind them, arms relaxed at his sides, observing not just Reeves, but the line itself, the subtle transformation taking place without command, without structure, without a single word of formal instruction. One recruit raised his rifle halfway, then lowered it again, uncertain. Another adjusted his stance, glancing at the flags, then at the dust near his boots, mimicking without realizing it, learning without being told. Turner exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing into something more controlled, more deliberate. He stepped forward and held the rifle out toward Reeves again, not as a challenge this time, not as a test, but as an offering, a recognition that whatever was happening here was beyond his ability to direct. Reeves looked at the rifle, then at Turner, then back toward the range, and for a moment it seemed like he might refuse, like he might step away and leave them with only what they had already seen. But instead he reached out and took it once more, the motion quiet, unremarkable, yet it carried weight across the entire line. The wind shifted again, a brief lull cutting through the stronger currents, dropping the pressure just enough to create a narrow window, invisible to most, but not to him. Reeves stepped back into position, not at the center, not where any of them would have stood, but slightly offset again, aligning himself with something none of them could measure. He raised the rifle, slower this time, more deliberate, his breathing steady, his posture unchanged, and the entire range seemed to hold with him. No movement, no sound beyond the distant snap of fabric and the low hum of heat rising from the ground. Noah felt it before he saw it. That brief alignment, that moment where the chaos of the wind folded into something singular, something usable. Now, he whispered under his breath without knowing why, and Reeves fired, the crack sharp and final, echoing once before dissolving into silence. No one moved, no one spoke, because they knew better now. They waited, watching not the plate, not the obvious, but the structure beneath it, the unseen points that held everything together. And for a long second nothing happened. Then a faint shift, a subtle movement at the base, the mount bending just enough to break its hold, and the target dropped again. Clean, precise, inevitable, and this time no one reacted at all, not because they were unimpressed, but because they understood, at least enough to know that what they had just witnessed was not something that could be reduced to a lesson. And as Reeves lowered the rifle for the final time, Hayes took a single step forward, his voice quiet but carrying across the stillness. "That is what they cannot teach," he said, and no one needed to ask what he meant. The range did not return to normal after the third shot, because there was no normal left to return to. The wind still moved across the open ground, flags snapping in layered currents between 9 and 15 miles per hour, dust lifting in thin spirals near the firing line. But none of it felt like noise anymore. It felt like language, like something that had always been there waiting to be understood. Reeves lowered the rifle for the last time and held it for a brief second, his fingers resting once more along the worn groove in the stock. Then he turned and handed it back to Turner without a word. The exchange quiet, almost weightless, but it carried more meaning than anything that had been said all day. Turner accepted it carefully this time, not gripping it with authority, but holding it with a new awareness, like it was no longer just a tool, but a reminder of everything he had missed. Hayes stepped forward fully now, closing the last bit of distance, his presence no longer just observed but felt by every person on the line. He looked at the recruits first, his gaze moving across them slowly, not inspecting, not judging, but measuring something deeper, something that had nothing to do with scores or accuracy. "You saw it," he said, his voice steady, grounded. "But that does not mean you understand it." No one answered, because no one could, not honestly. Noah felt that truth settle heavier than anything else, heavier than the silence, heavier than the shots, because it meant this was not something that could be repeated by simply trying harder. Hayes turned slightly, his attention returning to Reeves. "They will spend years chasing that," he said. Reeves gave a faint nod, his expression unchanged. "They should," he replied. "That is the only way it stays real." The words carried no pride, no instruction, just acceptance. As if the distance between knowing and understanding was something that could not be shortened, only walked. Turner shifted his stance, the rifle still in his hands, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier edge. "Sir, how do we teach it?" Hayes did not answer immediately, his eyes still on Reeves. But this time Reeves answered instead. "You do not," he said simply. Turner looked at him, confusion flickering, but Reeves continued. "You give them the conditions, you let them fail, and you wait." The explanation was minimal, almost frustrating in its simplicity, but Noah felt something click again, something deeper than technique, something about patience, about observation, about letting the answer reveal itself instead of forcing it into place. Hayes exhaled slowly, a faint trace of approval in the motion. "That is why most never reach it," he said. Reeves did not respond, because he did not need to. The truth of it was already evident in every missed shot from earlier that day. In every calculation that had failed to account for what could not be measured. The wind picked up again, stronger now, flags snapping sharply in opposing directions, the kind of condition that would have ended the exercise before. But now no one moved to stop. No one stepped back. The recruits remained where they were, watching, thinking, trying to see what they had not seen before. Hayes turned back toward them, his voice carrying just enough to settle the moment. "Reset the line," he said, and this time it was not an order to perform, but an invitation to begin again. Turner nodded once, firm, composed. "Yes, sir." And as the recruits moved to their positions, slower, more deliberate, Reeves stepped back from the line. His role already finished, he did not wait for acknowledgment, did not look for recognition. He simply turned and walked toward the edge of the range, his figure steady against the shifting heat. And for a brief moment, Noah considered calling out, asking something, anything, but the words did not come, because he understood now that there was nothing to ask that had not already been shown. And as Reeves reached the far edge, the wind shifted once more, carrying a faint, steady calm through the chaos, and behind him, the line came alive again, not louder, not faster, but different, more aware, more patient. And in that quiet change, something lasting had already taken hold, something no shot could fully explain, something that would follow them long after the targets were gone. Because respect was not something that could be demanded or taught. It was something that revealed itself, slowly, in the moments most people failed to see.